Ask someone how they would improve schools in Detroit or in Michigan for that matter. You'll get a lot of different ideas. What is the best way to raise test scores? Train teachers, get kids to school safely. Bottom line, what can we do so all kids can attain quality schools? After months of work, the Coalition for the Future of Detroit School Children released their recommendations this week for all Detroit schools. Tonight on MiWeek, Rakolta Jr., one of the leaders from the coalition and also the CEO of Walbridge, joins us to go through the report. How did the group arrive at these key conclusions? Are they in line with what the governor wants to do? And what will happen next? The Coalition for the Future of Detroit School Children made its long-awaited recommendations on Monday afternoon. A 30-page report, the end of 3 months of work, meetings, and forums. The 36-member group of business, community, philanthropy, and school leaders looked at all Detroit schools, public, charter, and EAA, and came up with these key proposals. Detroit public schools should be returned to the control of an elected school board. Form the Detroit Education Commission, members to be appointed by the mayor, and oversee opening and closings of schools. Make the state assume some of DPS's debt. End the Education Achievement Authority and turn those 15 schools back to DPS. Create a system to recruit and train high-quality teachers, and make charter authorizers and their boards improve transparency.
To improve transportation for all children. Some schools have transportation systems, others don't. So making sure that all children are able to get to school on time, and that are able to have access to that sort of a transportation system by communities.
This is not just a Detroit problem. It is a Michigan problem. It is an American problem. But we live in Detroit, so obviously we're concerned. But our state is not performing the way it should be. Public schools are not performing the way they should be. Unless we address the issues of poverty, of joblessness, and some of the other socioeconomic ills that plague our city and other communities, then the fix on education, while it might be much better than what we have, is still going to be void. It's still going to lack.
Now, the governor said he respects the coalition's work and plans to review the recommendations. So joining us now to go through all of this is Rakolta Jr. He's one of the coalition's co-chairs and the CEO of Walbridge. John, it's good to see you and welcome to MiWeek. We appreciate you being here.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
And also our MiWeek contributors, as always, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press and Nolan Finley of the Detroit News. All right, gentlemen, let's jump right in on this report. John, 3 months the coalition had a chance to work on this. Do you feel that you had enough time to achieve this end result?
We had time, probably not enough, to try to correct 40 years of problems and mistakes in 100 days is a very, very hard task. We worked hard, and we're very proud of the results that we came forth with.
You came forth with a 30-page report here. What were some of the tougher recommendations that you had to get agreement on?
Well, I think all 7 of them had various degrees of controversy. Obviously, returning to elected school board was one of them. The past hasn't necessarily produced the best results, and there was a lot of questions as to whether the system was in shape today to actually return to the school board, elected school board at this point in time. We do believe in the democratic process and the fact that Detroit currently is the only city in the state that does not have democratic representation in its public schools. So eventually we believe that that needs to take place, but we think that the fix needs to take place first.
Do you think that that is the most controversial part of the plan or the recommendations that came out?
I do not. I think probably the most difficult thing is going to be the debt. There's an enormous debt that's been placed on the Detroit public school system. It's choking off the resources before it gets to the kids. And Detroit today is the least city, or the city with the least amount of dollars going into the classroom, and it shows in the results.
Did you feel like, speaking of that financial problem, you guys suggest that the state ought to pay a significant portion of that debt on its own, but even if that happened, you're a finance guy. You see what's going on in the district. Is this a district that can survive financially? Even if you get that debt off of their backs, if you talk about the loss in population, the other inefficiencies in the way they do things, is that a solution?
That's just the first step. There needs to be a complete overhaul of the Detroit public school system. There are legacy costs that have no responsibility at the state level. Transportation's too expensive. There's too many buildings. The system's geared for 85,000 students. Today there's 45,000. Central administration is far too expensive, and the list goes on and on. And so what we're saying is that DPS has a place. We believe that it needs to be fair and open competition, but that there needs to be a complete restructuring of how the entire school district works.
As a finance person, did you suggest the idea of bankruptcy in these deliberations at all, or did you think that was something you guys ought to think about?
I think that the first conclusion would have been bankruptcy if it's possible, but it's not possible because of some of the more technical aspects of the bond issues. They all would become due and payable, including the millage bonds, and that number is just far too large to swallow at this point in time. So a traditional bankruptcy is not a solution today.
John, I heard Tanya Allen this week say that a primary mission of this group was to create a level playing field for all schools in the city. But taking a look at the performance of the Detroit Public Schools and its defiance of reform over all of these years, was there any consideration at all to saying this DPS can't be fixed? Let's start with something that looks totally different, perhaps a New Orleans model where they chartered all of the schools. Was that ever on the table?
There's 45,000 kids in DPS today, and just to start over, we believe is impractical. We don't see a pathway of closing an entire system down. What do you do with those 45,000 kids this September? So the fix has to be measured, it has to be consistent, has to be ongoing, but it's going to take some time. There's just no practical way to shut a system down that large and start over.
What's creating a level field look like?
That all the schools compete fairly on all aspects. Both of them have their own sets of problems. DPS is burdened by legacy cost. Charter schools have their own burdens. They have to pay for their own buildings in their own schools, which is a burden on their finances. Charter schools have to provide transportation to all of its students and parents. There is no central transportation system. And so we need to fix all of these and let both systems compete against each other. And from my perspective, that's the best solution, to have open and fair competition from two completely different systems and let the best system win.
Let's talk a little bit about the Educational Achievement Authority. One of the recommendations was that those 15 schools that are part of the EAA, which are Detroit schools, should go back to DPS. What was the thought or the rationale behind that?
Well, that was one of the controversial discussions, and we settled on the idea that EAA does belong back at DPS eventually. I mean, that's the whole intent of the law that was passed in 2009 called the SSRO and the SSRD, the State System Reform Office and the State System Reform District. And the law provides that the Department of Education identifies the 5% of non-performing or low-performing schools, and they go into this district. After their reform, they would go back to their public school districts, and that's exactly what we have recommended, that the EAA become part of the law. There is a law that's currently structured that will allow us to reform and restructure a school district like the EAA.
So you say eventually they should return, and when you're talking about control of the school board, you say eventually DPS should go back to an elected school board. So people at home or parents might say, okay, well, what kind of timeline are you looking at when you say eventually? What kind of time do we see?
I don't have a timeline for you because a lot of this depends upon the acceptance of the governor and then obviously changing law at the legislature level to be able to implement these recommendations. These recommendations cannot be implemented unilaterally. We're going to have to change the way Michiganders see public education.
All right, go ahead.
I covered DPS 20 years ago for the Free Press and saw lots of different ideas and plans, lots of different reform agendas rolled out, and they all were very well intentioned. A lot of them were very well thought out, and they all failed. Tell me why this is different than any of those and why you think it might have a better chance of success.
Well, I believe that, number one, we're at a tipping point. Many forces have come together. The legacy cost, the depopulation of the city of Detroit, Detroit's bankruptcy. I believe that the citizens and this coalition, the legislature and the governor have this unique opportunity to make a significant change and a significant difference. Other than that, it's going to just take a lot of hard work, a lot of debate, and for us to settle on what's right for our state. And we're at this crossroads because Michigan has continued to sink over the last 10, 15 years in terms of its academic achievement. What's interesting is that I believe it's 15 years ago, Michigan was tied with Massachusetts as the 23rd best state for public education. Since that period of time, Michigan has slipped from 23rd to something in the 40s. I don't recall if it was 45th or 48th. And Massachusetts has gone to number 1. We need to take a look at these states that have achieved such tremendous success and emulate them and copy many of the things that they've done. It's worked. We need to bring it to Michigan and make it work here.
And that's more of a statewide issue. I mean, what you're talking about there, that's not just about Detroit. Some of the things that you guys are seeing in DPS and in the charter schools here are common, in Ishpeming or in Manistee.
That's true, absolutely. What's interesting is that last year, out of the 500 and some school districts in the state, all but one lost student population. So much of this is also caused by the depopulation. This is where the budget problem, the substantial portion of the budget problem is coming from. You just can't catch up fast enough in terms of reducing your fixed cost to keep pace with the vast number of students that are leaving.
Now, John, you all recommended that this commission, that I assume will serve until the school board takes over. I don't know what role it would have afterwards, but that the commission members will be all appointed by the mayor. Doesn't that inject the potential for politics into this process?
We don't believe so, and I don't want you to confuse the Detroit Public School Board with the Detroit Education Commission. They're completely separate. We need some authority that oversees education across the whole city. If nothing more than to the opening, closing, and the positioning of schools and the making sure there are standards that we can measure low-performing schools by and have common agreement as to when we close them, whether they be DPS schools, charter schools, EAA schools, or any other kind of schools. So the Detroit Election Commission is not intended to replace the DPS.
But you've structured it so that the mayor would appoint all the members. Was there any discussion that of having the governor appoint a few, someone else, so that you get a more diverse voice there?
We preferred to allow the governor and the mayor to debate that issue themselves.
All right, so let's talk about the governor. Obviously, the coalition is going to hand him and his people this report. What are you hearing so far? He said in public, well, I'm going to take a look and thank them very much for their work. But what do you think the possibility of him implementing the majority of your recommendations really is?
They're sound recommendations, and I fully expect myself that the government's going to take a good look at them, and he's going to implement many of them. I mean, he knows he has a problem with the EAA today, and we've given him a very good solution. Fund the law the way it was intended and put the EAA schools into the state reform district. That's a great solution for him. He's taken that and put it into the Department of Management and Budget. He'll still be able to control it and just follow the law. The law is very prescriptive in what to do. Some of these other things might be a little bit more difficult, especially the debt. I'm sure the legislature is going to have a lot to say about that. But at the end of the day, what's really happening here is concerning the debt and also the pension payments. We are paying for yesterday's sins with tomorrow's children. And it's just unacceptable to the coalition, and it's personally unacceptable to me. I think it borders on being immoral.
As we wrap up here, John, what has the reaction been of parents in the Detroit schools to this report?
I don't know. I have not come in contact with parents since this has been released. I can tell you this, that I've spent significant amount of time traveling to schools with parents and trying to understand the condition the system and how they felt about it. And all I can say is that they were very, very encouraging for us to go as far and as deep as we possibly can in our recommendation. There's a great frustration in the city of Detroit. The vast majority of parents that I've come in contact with understand the need for education, understand the need for skills going forward, and they want their children to have a better life than them. And we all know it starts with education.
John Rakolta, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll be watching now in the next couple of months to see where this goes. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.